The COVID-19 pandemic was catastrophic, disastrous, and unforgettable. But what do we know about the impact of this pandemic on informal workers, especially in the global south? And what lessons can we draw for the future? In this special episode of the book series, I prepared 5 questions for 3 highly esteemed authors who recently published a book entitled COVID-19 and the Informal Economy: Impact, Recovery, and the Future. This book was published by Oxford University Press, and a copy of it can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video. I spoke with these 3 authors earlier this morning. Enjoy the show. My dear panelists, thank you so much for making the time. I'm very happy to have you. So I just want us to get started with some introductions. I'll get you to briefly talk about your research interests, the work that you have been doing, the classes that you teach, and the places that you are currently working at the moment.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I'm Kunal Sen. I'm the director of United Nations University, World Institute for Development Economics Research, UNE-WIDER, which is based in Helsinki, Finland. UNE-WIDER is a development economics think tank that combines both the research think tank and also an UN agency. We have been in existence for 39 years. Next year is our 40th anniversary. And we essentially work on research and capacity building in the global south. I'm an economist myself. I'm also a professor of development economics on leave from the University of Manchester in the UK. In terms of my research interests, I have been working on the political economy of growth, labor markets, informality, and also on trade and structural adjustment. And so if you have to sort of say my 3 main research interests is on political economy, on labor markets, and on trade and international economics. Those are the 3 broad interests that I have. I've also worked on poverty and inequality also in terms of my previous research. My geographical focus, especially now currently, though I work extensively on India, I've been working quite a bit on Sub-Saharan Africa in more recent years, and also on East Asia. So while India has been my primary focus earlier, in recent years, I've been working on quite a bit on Sub-Saharan Africa and also on East Asia, particularly Southeast Asia. And I do not have to do any teaching in the UNE-WIDER. We don't have any teaching programs. And so I'm in a very nice situation, perhaps, where I do not have any teaching here in UNE-WIDER. When I was in the University of Manchester, I taught courses on institutional economics. I taught courses on macroeconomics. I've taught courses on poverty and inequality. So previously, I've done a lot of teaching, mostly to master students and some PhD students, around a range of courses around institutions, macroeconomics, and also poverty and inequality. Thank you.
I'm based at Rhodes University in South Africa, and I also work with a global advocacy research network called WIGO, which stands for Women in Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. I think Marty might say something more about that in a moment. She's one of the co-founders of the organization. And it's largely concerned with supporting the livelihoods of informal workers and their organizations. In terms of my research, similar to Kunal, I have a background in researching things such as labor markets, with a particular focus on informal employment, and then a wide range of areas of interest in development economics. I've published on things such as the measurement of poverty and inequality, looking at gender, particularly in the labor markets, and extending that into areas such as food security, food insecurity. So I guess broadly, my research could be seen as focusing on labor markets and human development. I teach at the undergraduate and graduate levels here in South Africa, At the moment, my main teaching focus is on various courses related to development economics and several courses in applied microeconomics.
Thank you so much. And I have worn two main hats for the last many years. One is I've been teaching at Harvard University since the late 1980s. The other is that I was a co-founder and was the international coordinator of this WeGo network that Mike referred to, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. And the courses that I've taught at Harvard have focused on the informal economy. One was called Is Formalization the Answer? And another was called Cities and the Informal Economy, Rethinking Urban Development Planning and Design, which I co-taught with an Indian architect scholar and another Indian who works on urban issues at MIT. And in my research, all of my research since co-founding WeGo in 1997 has been focused on the informal economy. Currently, I'm writing up our findings on the urban informal economy with 3 or 4 WeGo colleagues for a handbook on urbanization in the global south. And I'm doing some strands of work on waste pickers and climate change and methane. And the big new project is a project looking at enterprises in India, which would look at what share of enterprises are informal in key sectors by size, by location, and a number of variables, with the view that the informal enterprises should also get more support in the growth of the Indian economy. So I think I'll end there, but I should add that Kunal and I taught, and Mike, all 3 of us were part of a MOOC course that WIDER ran. So you were teaching, Kunal, in a MOOC course on labor markets and structural transformation with a strong focus on the informal workforce. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Now, I would want to get Professor Kunal Sen started with the discussion for the book. What would you say are the core ideas of the book, and what is its central argument?
So what I will first do is set out the outline of the book just to give a sense what the book is about. So the book itself has 3 sections. The first section is on impact of the pandemic on mostly informal workers. We have 7 chapters there. We're covering a range of countries and regions in the global south. In fact, we cover all the important regions of the global south. 7 chapters, an introductory chapter. And then we have a section on recovery, which is about recovery and stimulus programs that were undertaken by developing country governments during the pandemic and even after. So we have 2 chapters there. And then we have a 3rd section on the future of informal work, what we have learned from the pandemic in terms of the informal work, but also the labor markets generally. And there we have 3 chapters. Then we have reflections of various distinguished scholars on short reflections. And then we have a concluding chapter which brings together the conclusions of the volume and some key policy implications that follow from the different chapters in the volume. So there's 3 sections. And I think that we can say that in each of the sections, we make at least one very important point. And I'll therefore go through each of the sections, what's the most important point. The first section on the impact, what we do say there is that we do by putting together evidence from many different approaches. We using survey data, using fieldwork, qualitative data, as I said, combining data in mixed methods and so on across a range of countries in the global south. What we show there's a huge and very significant disproportionate impact of the pandemic on informal workers. So while workers in general were affected by the pandemic and associated lockdown measures the governments took, informal workers are particularly very badly affected, very severely affected. And we provide actual numbers on how much they were affected in different countries for which we have data. So that's an important point that we show. And we show that this understanding of the impact of the pandemic on informal workers needs to be context specific, needs to be nuanced. They need to understand exactly how it has played out in different ways across different types of workers, across different types of employment, across different regions, across gender, and so on. And so while, of course, overall the effect is very negative, we also need to understand the nuanced nature of the way it actually worked in different contexts and different regions. That's very important to do. And we think that this particular volume is able to do that because the way we covered the Global South in our work, combining different data sets and different methods of collecting data, and so we're able to provide a kind of overall holistic approach to understanding the impact of the pandemic on informal workers. In our view, that has not happened in any other competing research studies that we have seen. So that's very important. How much we now know from the volume about the impact of the pandemic on informal workers. The second important point comes now from the second part of the book, which is about recovery and stimulus packages. And we show in this particular part of the book, the second part of the book, there's been a neglect of informal workers in economic recovery programs, stimulus programs, so on. So while many countries in the Global South ran recovery programs and stimulus programs of various shapes and dimensions, sometimes quite not very adequate in any case, but generally they have not able to incorporate informal workers in those recovery and stimulus programs. There was a serious neglect of informal workers in this recovery and stimulus programs. So that's the second point we're making in the volume, and that comes from our second section in the book. On the third section of the book, which is about the future, we make this point that what we have seen in this particular experience that informal workers experienced during the pandemic is an old bad deal, a deal that does not incorporate them as stakeholders with the state and and business and so on. So what we saw in the pandemic is the old bad deal, which we hope in the future we could think of a better new deal. Later on, we'll hear from Marty Chen on more on that. But I think the point that we want to make here is that we really cannot have the deal that we saw between the informal workers, the state, and the private sector, capital, in the future. And that's an important point we make from the third section of the volume. So each section has one important point to make, and overall, these are the three most important points we're making in the volume. There are several other points, but I'm not going to go into that. I think we should also reflect a little bit on policies, and I think that's important because what have we learned about policies from the core arguments of the book? On policies, one can make 3 points. First, on economic policies, there's an argument that we need to have more broad-based and more inclusive policies that take into account informal workers, their livelihoods, and so on. So we need to think about a more broad-based approach to economic policies, which we did not see during the pandemic, especially when you look at on what happened in the recovery phase of the pandemic. So we need to think about more broad-based, more inclusive policies that incorporates informal workers in the recovery and stimulus programs for the future. So that's the one on economic policies. Social protection was very important. We did see quite a bit of that in the pandemic and the post-pandemic period. But it's also true to say that often they were not enough for informal workers. Sometimes they came too late. Sometimes they just could not reach informal workers. So what you got to make sure next time around, in case we have a similar crisis, we need to crisis-proof social protection programs. We need to make sure ex ante that we build in a design implementation of social protection programs that they are crisis-proof. In other words, ex ante, we make sure that if there is another crisis, social protection programs can work on their own to protect informal workers. That was not the case with the COVID-19 pandemic, and we cannot have the same situation going forward. So on that, I think the lessons we learned on that is social protection works, did help in many contexts, in many cases, but they were not strong enough in their design and implementation, and we need to think a bit more about how we can make them crisis-proof. So that's the second point on the policies. On the third point, the policies probably is a broader point, and the point again will be discussed by Marty Chen later on, is about a new social contract that we have to have between informal workers and key stakeholders like the state and business and so on. So the new social contract is absolutely critical in thinking about how we can deal with something of this kind that might happen again in the future. So the new social contract that we argue for at the end of the book is a very important contribution we're making in understanding the nature of this pandemic and its implications for informal workers going forward. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
That is great, Professor Kunal Sen. Thank you so much. Let me now get in Professor Martha Chen into the discussion. What is the contribution of this book to the existing body of knowledge on COVID-19?
Thank you for that question. And I think Kunal Sen has summarized the book so well that he has spoken to several of the contributions that this particular volume makes. And I'll start with the fact that the impact section has studies from a variety of countries based on different kinds of data sets. And it also includes a look at national data that it continues through in some countries that continues through till 2022. So it's not just one point in time during the pandemic. It covers a range. So that I think is a very large contribution. But I should just quickly say that from our knowledge of other, not just books, but publications and studies, there has been more focus on the health impacts than on livelihood impacts in general. There's some studies that compare the impacts on formal workers versus informal workers, which our data from the different sources also tries to do. But there's less, if any, focus on the differential impact within the informal economy, the heterogeneity of the informal economy. There's been some focus on comparing impact on women versus men workers, but what we call for, and which the data also illustrate the need for, is you have to look at the intersectionality. You can't compare all women workers with all men workers. You have to compare women and men within the formal economy, women and men within the informal economy, and then women formal versus women informal, not just versus men. The intersectionality is so important, and we have that in the book. Also, many of the existing publications stop at the impact stage. They look at the severity of the impact, let's say, but they don't also look at recovery measures, which the second section of the book seeks to do, and it doesn't look at the future in terms of the policy lessons. So I think we have brought a lot of that in. And so in terms of the heterogeneity within the informal economy, we look at status in employment, the wage employed versus the self-employed versus the subcontracted. We looked at different occupational groups, and there is difference in how much they were impacted. And I should say something about the focus on formal workers. A lot of the focus was on formal workers who then had to begin working from their home. But what we found was that most workers informal had to stop work. And the ones that were most severely impacted were actually the home-based workers, the traditional home-based workers, because the global supply chains that they produce goods and services for broke down. So the difference between you and me starting to work from home, which we could do and do, and the traditional home-based worker who's producing goods for a global supply chain, she was most affected by. So we've brought out these kinds of differences, which I think are a real contribution of the book. And of course, we have sections on recovery and the future, which we will speak to. Thank you.
That's great. So now let's move on to our next question. I want you all to talk about the major findings of the book and the major lessons of the book. So now I will get us started again. I'll come back to you, Professor Kunal Sen. I would want you to speak particularly about the major findings of the book and its major lessons in terms of the focus on impact.
So as I was saying, when I mentioned about what the book's core ideas are, or impact, what we saw were a severe impact. And I'm going to give some numbers here because it's important to understand the magnitude of the impact on informal workers. So first point I'm going to make is about severity of the impact that we saw in the different chapters that we had on different countries and regions. So just to give you some numbers. So for example, the chapter by Chen and Vanek finds that 22 million jobs were lost in 5 countries in Latin America. 22 million jobs. That's a lot of jobs. So that's one example of the magnitude of the impact. The chapter by Rogan and Skinner finds South Africa that in 2020 quarter 2, we had about 2.2 million jobs lost. That quarter 2, 2020, if you recall, is just as soon as the lockdown started in South Africa and also elsewhere. Quarter 1 was when the pandemic was beginning to spread. So 2.2 million jobs lost in South Africa in quarter 2. But even when we get to quarter 4 in 2020 in South Africa, 1.4 million net jobs lost. So over the period that we are seeing, and that's true in South Africa as an example, true for many other countries in the global south, we see persistent losses in informal employment over that year and also the following year. That's 2020 and 2021. Because of course, in 2021, we had the second wave, as we know, of the pandemic. So that's first point. Severe losses. Numbers are staggering, really, and these are numbers that we get from our own the survey data we have, and also our secondary data sets, and so quite reliable numbers that we are providing here. So, and may well even be an underestimate for all you know, actually. So severity. The second point, as was mentioned by Marty Chen, is very important because this is something I think the volume really does contribute quite significantly, is the heterogeneity of the impact. So the impact, as I said, the aggregate impact strongly negative, but the way it worked out was quite different in different contexts. So let me give examples of that. On gender, women were more badly affected than men. And that's one reason being, obviously, women tend to be more in the informal sector, especially in self-employment, informal self-employment, than men. Women are very badly affected than men, number one. Number two, self-employment versus wage employment. These are different types of employment. But self-employed workers are more badly affected than wage-employed workers. I mean, again, you can imagine this. Lockdowns and so on, street vendors cannot go out and work, and others similarly work. Others who depend on going out to work every day simply could not go out to work. So self-employed workers were more badly affected than wage-employed workers, though they both, of course, were also negatively impacted. Number two. Number three, type of work. So type of work, Marty Chen has already mentioned this. Home-based workers, street vendors were very badly affected, exactly as I mentioned for lockdowns and so on. Compared to, say, domestic workers, West speakers. Now, we're not talking about a situation where some group of workers were actually okay. No, not at all. We're all affected. But some types of workers, some kind of jobs were more affected than others. And that's important to keep in mind, that we see heterogeneity, the type of work impacted. In this particular case, home-based workers, street vendors, particularly badly affected compared to domestic workers, West speakers, and other informal workers. So that's number 3 point about the type of work. Also, we saw, and that is very interesting because we had comparable a chapter, 11 city study by Marty Chen and others, where we could look at different cities in the global south. And again, we find that what was interesting is that some cities were pretty badly affected in the first wave, the 2020, and some cities were very badly affected in the second wave. And of course, some cities were badly affected in both waves. And there were quite differential impacts. For example, Bangkok and Pleven, these 2 cities that in this 11-city study, seem to have recovered a little bit in the 2021 compared to 2020. So this important point is that the pandemic had, because of the different waves, had differential impacts over time and across location. And that's important to keep in mind, that the nature of the pandemic was that there was not one effect, it was over time, and it differed across location. So that's a very important point to make. We also have a very interesting chapter that looks at within household effects. And that's something we don't know much about because it's very difficult to know what happened within households. We find, interesting enough, and this is a particular qualitative study in Delhi of domestic workers, that women who could still go to work in a situation where the husband doesn't have a job, had more bargaining power in the family, which actually in a strange way helps them to make important decisions for the children and for the family. So again, it's interesting to see that even within the household, we had differential impact. And that's something perhaps is not recognized in the literature that we've seen on the COVID-19 pandemic itself. So that was the second point about the impact on heterogeneity. The third point about impact is what we call amplified vulnerabilities. So vulnerabilities, because the informal workers were already very vulnerable prior to the pandemic, that's obvious. But the pandemic simply led to pre-existing inequalities and fault lines being exacerbated because the pandemic particularly hit the informal workers more so than any other group of workers. So there we saw very different effects, very different context-specific effects by type of work, status in employment, gender, caste, race, and so on. So the point here again is already there were existing fault lines of society. Informal workers are paid the least, they are the most vulnerable workers, and then the pandemic hits them more so than any other type of workers. And of course, they face this particular pandemic in a different way than a worker who can be doing remote working, a professional, and so on, who's less affected by the pandemic. So that's also important to keep in mind that the pandemic simply got the fault lines, but they're already there in society, got worse because of the pandemic. And I think that's something that we need to think for the future, which I think we'll be discussing later in this today. The fourth point also is a question that one might ask is, how did these workers cope? They didn't have a job sometimes, they had very reduced earnings sometimes. In any case, they were poor, so how did they cope? And our volume sheds light on the coping strategies that these workers used and the families used. And generally, the coping strategies were, as you might expect, quite a situation, but led them to further problems down the road. In fact, even after the pandemic, even later on, much later than the pandemic had ended, these workers were very vulnerable because of what they had to do to cope with the pandemic. Two examples. One is that they had to borrow because they had reduced earnings, because they were unemployed. They had to borrow. And usually the borrowing had to happen from friends and family because banks were closed, microfinance institutions were closed. They could not go and travel to the nearest microfinance institution for borrowing because of lockdown. So usually they found ways to borrow from their friends and family. And of course that was, or even from informal money lenders. And that of course led to bigger problems going forward, because if you're borrowing from an informal money lender, you're borrowing at a very high interest rate. So borrowing is one strategy. The second strategy was whatever their meager savings they had, usually cash they kept at home, were reduced also. So they were reducing their savings, whatever savings they had, because they had to simply find a way to survive with almost zero income. So that was one thing they had to do. The second thing they had to do was find a way to somehow survive, which meant that they had to adjust their consumption. Of course, simply not have any other consumption apart from food, but even within food consumption, they had to adjust. So they tried to maintain a basic subsistence diet of pulses, for example, but where they had to reduce intake of milk and meat and so on, the more luxury consumption items, which is, of course, as one knows, these are very important for protein intake. So even within consumption of food, they were adjusting, finding a way to somehow keep going on the basic stuff they needed to have simply to survive. And that's something, again, I think one has to keep in mind, that the kind of way they had to cope, of course, would have long-term impacts on nutritional intake for not only themselves, but also their children. So we do not yet know what those long-term impacts might well be in the future. So I'm going to stop here. I just wanted to give you a sense of the section of impact. Hope it provides you some clarity on exactly how the impact happened. Simple point to summarize is context-specific, localized, nuanced ways that the pandemic affected informal workers. And the lesson here really is to understand how nuanced and how context-specific the impact was on informal workers. Thank you.
Wonderful. That is great, Professor Kunal Sen. Let me now get in the discussion. Professor Michael Rogan, in terms of recovery, what would you say are the major findings of the book, and what are the major lessons?
Yeah, thanks. And just to put it into perspective, given that severe and disproportionate shock to the informal economy in many countries. The second section of the book has two chapters, which tries to understand how well matched different government responses were to that impact on informal employment. In other words, we know that the informal economy was disproportionately affected. So was policy disproportionately targeted or focused on helping the informal economy recover? These two chapters looked at both the short-term impacts. At the time the book was written, many governments were undertaking emergency responses to the pandemic. And then one of the chapters looks at the longer-term recovery, how governments saw the economic recovery panning out over time, and whether and how they supported informal workers in these recoveries. So, I think it's useful to sort of step back and look at the bigger picture before getting into some of the country level examples. So one of the key findings that came out at the beginning of the pandemic was globally, progress towards poverty reduction may have been set back for up to 20 years. And that 20-year impact on progress towards poverty reduction largely came through the large negative impact on informal workers, which is not surprising when you consider that globally 61% of workers are informal. And in emerging economies and developing economies where poverty levels are higher, most employees are informal. Think about a country like India or Ghana, where close to 90% of total employment is informal. So the impact on informal workers in these countries had a large and potentially lasting effect on poverty and the prospects for meeting our international commitments to poverty reduction. So the question then is, did the fiscal response by governments match the severity of those impacts? So one of the statistics that came out a little bit after the pandemic from the IMF was that of the global fiscal response to the pandemic, just under 14% was directed towards the recovery in emerging economies or middle-income countries, and less than half of 1% was spent in developing countries, which means that the places where the impact was most severe, there's a real imbalance in where the recovery or the stimulus funding was actually directed at a global level. So right at the beginning, you can see there was a bit of a mismatch to where the impact was felt and where the recovery was directed. I think one of the more interesting chapters in the middle section of the book on recovery tried to understand longer-term economic recovery in terms of a gap analysis and how informal workers were included in recovery schemes. And using a number of different case studies, both developing countries and middle-income countries, it found that quite a few governments were focusing on new jobs and economic growth. And I think we'd all agree that that's not a bad thing at all. We want growth and we want new jobs, and we need both of those things. But there was almost no mention of the way that informal workers or informal economies could be included in growth plans or job creation. And relatedly, there was no discussion on how to support informal workers in their existing jobs. It seemed to be a case of one or the other in terms of many government recovery plans. So one of the authors of the chapters in the middle of the book suggested that there was a very strong sense that policy was based on the world in which we wanted to live in, rather than starting with a point of departure from the world in which we do live in. And again, think of a country like India or Ghana, where 90% of employment is informal. One got the sense that many government recovery policies were hoping to sort of wish away informal employment, rather than supporting the groups of workers that were the most severely affected by the pandemic, as Kunal has explained. Quite a few countries used the opportunity to reset their development and economic recovery strategies by identifying sectors of the economy that had the most potential for growth. And again, there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself, but there were quite a few gender imbalances in many of these recovery plans. The sectors that were being targeted for growth and fiscal support were predominantly men, whereas we know that the pandemic had a strong gender focus. So there wasn't quite an alignment with the promotion and the support of sectors of the economy in which informal workers in particular, or in general, and female or women informal workers in particular are concentrated. So, I mean, one way that the recovery was characterized by the contributors to the volume was more a case of partial relief rather than a longer-term inclusive recovery that recognized the existing role of informal workers in many of the sectors of the economy which were very negatively affected. So one tentative conclusion from the middle portion of the book is that the severity of the impact on the informal economy, which again Kunal has explained in excellent detail, was not reflected in the either size or the shape of the economic response. So it feels as though there was an opportunity missed to reset once we recognized how large the impact was on the informal economy and how detrimental this was to many of our long-term international commitments, such as the Sustainable Development Goals. In terms of lessons going forward, I think this was an important reminder that we can't and shouldn't wish away the informal economy. As I mentioned earlier, I think there's consensus that we need growth and we need new jobs, but that doesn't mean that you can't also at the same time have a policy context which is supportive of the livelihoods of the vast majority of workers in the world and in particular in middle income and developing countries. So what we really need is the type of recovery that includes the informal economy and seeks to create growth and new jobs. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there, and I'll come back with a few reflections at the end. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you so much. Professor Martha Chen, let me get you in. So in terms of the future, what would you say are the major findings of the book and what are the major lessons? Or wait. You need to unmute yourself first.
Oh,
yes,
thank you.
That's fine now.
I'll start with the past, the more recent past, and then get to the future. So pre-COVID, what we know is, like Mike has said, that 61% of all workers globally, 2 billion workers, were informally employed. You move to developing countries like Ghana and India, well, they're both now middle income. It's 90%. And in emerging economies, on average, it's 67%. So it's only really in developed countries where you have a very much smaller informal workforce at around 18% of all workers. The second point pre-COVID was the bad old deal that Kunal referred to, because the informal economy in many policymaking circles is seen as a problem. It should go away, and it's seen as largely illegal or non-compliant or evading taxes or creating dirt and squalor. You know, it has a lot of negative associations going into it. When the pandemic hit and the related lockdowns, this was the first crisis in which it was recognized that the informal workforce was disproportionately impacted. That was good. The other good thing was that there was early on in the pandemic, especially during the lockdowns, an appreciation that many informal workers are frontline workers, or conversely, that many frontline workers are informally employed. So you think of the people who produce, process, prepare, distribute food. Most of them are informally employed. You think of the health workers, other than the doctors and some of the nurses, a lot of the health workers, the primary frontline workers like the ambulance drivers and technicians, they would also be informally employed, right? The workers who provide childcare and the workers who provide elder care. You think of construction, transport, sanitation, recycling. Many of the workers, frontline workers, are informally employed. And at the beginning of the pandemic, we were clapping, we were pounding pots and pans, we were celebrating the frontline workers. But you move along and, and in that early phase, you had the government scrambling to do some relief. And there were some failures in the social registries and the delivery systems, but that's when the relief came in. as you move further into the second wave or the second year, third year of the pandemic, the attention dwindled. We weren't singing their praises. We weren't pounding pots and pans. So by the time we got to the recovery phase, as Mike has pointed out, very few, if any, countries really took seriously that you needed to help the informal workers, the informal enterprises recover as part of the future. And in fact, we experienced, the WeGo network tracked this outside the volume, but we've tracked it, that we actually ended up with a worse New Deal in many situations, because in the name of public health or in the name of economic recovery, you had governments tearing down outdoor markets, you had the goods and equipment of informal workers being confiscated and removed. And so there was a real risk of a worse New Deal. And we knew that what was happening was that during the pandemic, you had runaway wealth at the top of the economy, and you had this deepened poverty at the base. So that's the context for the section of the volume on the future. And the first chapter in it focuses on social protection, and it focuses on both what happened. You know, social protection has two broad components. One is social assistance and one is social insurance. So under social assistance is where the relief came in, but there were some failings in the system. One that was particularly glaring from the 11-city study that WeGo did was a city that was sort of the t-shirt capital of the world in South India, and a lot of the workers are home-based. But in that state, the home-based workers were not part of the social registry. The only workers in that t-shirt capital that were registered were the ones who worked in factories. So there was a problem in the registry, there was a problem in the distribution. The government distributed in India whole grains to people, but there were no food mills to have that whole grains processed. So they needed food or they needed flour. So the studies showed some of the inadequacies in the relief system, and there really is a need to stress test these social protection systems for future crises. But the other part of the social protection chapter is on universal social protection. And there is a growing call for universal social protection, but from competing quarters. And some who see it through a social justice lens, and some of it who see it more through an efficiency lens. And what is needed, according to the chapter that was written by two people from the WeGo social protection program, is a need to look at the benefit package, what benefits are needed through the lens of the informal workers and their organizations, and to look at the financing to make it more progressive and not regressive. So there's a commitment to universal social protection and to include the informal workers, but the worker organizations and leaders need to be part of the discussion on the benefit package and on the financing, because the capacity of the informal workers to actually finance, make their own contributions when they're in deep poverty is a real question. And then there was a chapter on a new social compact. And one of the departing positions of that paper is that usually it's in compacts, social contracts or social compacts, it's state and citizens, and it's employers and employees. But we are living in a world in which almost half, 44% of all workers are self-employed. And if you move to the informal workers, it's 2/3 to 3/4. And if you move to, let's take the example of cities, the policies that matter for a self-employed urban informal workers is not labor policies and labor employer practices. It's the rules and policies and practices of local government. And so we're calling for a contract that also addresses the relationship between the state and the self-employed workers particularly. Of course, there's also the role of the state in regulating the employment relations where there is an employment relation in the informal economy, and also in regulating the commercial relationships. Because certainly what we saw during the pandemic, that there was no commitment on the part of any company or employer for the workers that were no longer able to work in their value chains. So there, and some of them were self-employed suppliers and others were wage workers, and some were what are called now dependent contractors. They're subcontracted by the employer. So there's the whole new social compact has to be rethought, reflecting the reality of labor markets today, which are highly informal and are in fact becoming probably more informal because a lot of platform work is also informal because the employer-employee relationship is not recognized, and or the dependency relationship, and the platform owners are not making contributions to the worker benefits or social protection of the people in their platform work. And that's a definition of informality. So those two chapters deal with that, but there's also a call across the book for looking at economic policies as well. And one chapter on impact from Bangladesh, written by two economists, calls for macro investments in reducing the cost burden of the informal workers. So macro investment in health and education, of course, but also in utilities and transport and other things that would make earning a living easier and more remunerative for the informal workers. There's also a call going through the book for more sectoral policies that reflect an understanding of informal workers' contributions and also the constraints and risks they have. And notably, many of the examples are from the urban informal economy, where urban development and design and planning can be very inimical to the and very exclusionary of the informal workforce, and needing to change that. And at the root of all of that is something that comes out of the economics discipline, not completely, but many mainstream economic thinkers see the informal economy in very negative terms. Like I mentioned earlier, that they're non-compliant, they're not paying taxes, they're a drag on the economy, ergo to be done away with. And one of the lead thinkers in that perspective has just advised the new president of Mexico that the informal economy is something to worry about and not give perverse incentives to people to be informal. So there's a mindset change that needs to happen in order to have this better New Deal. So it's a set of social policies and economic policies, but it's a mindset change that the informal workforce is not only so big and significant, but it also contributes to the economy, to society, to environment. And I'll just close by saying I was at the launch of the International Alliance of Waste Pickers in Buenos Aires the first 5 days of May. And what they are calling for the future is to be integrated into the solid waste management systems of the city. And if dumps and landfills are closed because of methane emissions and all of that, they should be integrated backward into the supply chain of the waste. And that's the kind of future that we see. And one of the people who reflected on the volume, we had a group of leading scholars, was Barbara Harris White, and she talked about the waste workers in India, who are largely from low caste or tribal communities in India. And she called for a transformation of the system So I think that's really what we're talking for, is that since it's so large and so in so many sectors, that the informal economy needs to be recognized for its contributions and be integrated into the recovery and the economic policies and the social policies on better terms going forward. Thank you.
That is so great. Thank you so much, Professor Martha Chen. Now let me get to the last segment of our discussion, in which I would like to bring Professor Michael Rogan. What is the target audience of this book, and who can we say will greatly benefit if they are to get their hands on this book?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it probably wouldn't be appropriate for us to say that everybody should read this book, but that's obviously how we feel. Yeah, I think from the beginning we had in our minds that this book was pretty evenly targeted to policymakers and researchers. In terms of policymakers, you've heard Marty explain the sort of effort that went into identifying and outlining the different types of economic policies that would be more inclusive than the standard types of policies, which, whether implicitly or explicitly, sort of tried to wish away the informal economy rather than understanding the lives of the working poor and what provides their households with basic needs. This was really a moment, I think, in global terms, for understanding policies related to social protection. It was such a shock to so many countries at the same time. It was a real test of social protection systems and social policies in many countries. And I think there have been a lot of lessons learned, which are outlined quite neatly, quite elegantly in the chapter on social protection in the book. What do countries need to understand about the role of social protection and how it covers different groups of workers, and how it can actually relate to productivity in and of itself by protecting workers from risks that are beyond this control. Obviously, it doesn't always have to be something so extreme as a global pandemic, but it was a real lens with which to understand how social protection interacts with labor markets in a wide range of different types of countries and economies. From a research perspective, I think there's a lot in the book that will interest economists, historians, sociologists, those interested in politics. It's relatively multidisciplinary. And I think, within the context of ongoing changes to labor markets, as Marty mentioned a bit, move towards the gig economy, platform work, different types of employment, the role of technology. This is a real sort of baseline type of assessment of what's happening in labor markets. And it's the basis from which we can monitor how we recover, both from this crisis and alongside changes to the labor market more generally. I think there's also, the book opens up some interesting possibilities for future research in terms of understanding the financing of things like social protection. I think it also offers some interesting possibilities for trying to test and evaluate different interventions, for example, to support different types of informal work, trying to measure the productivity gains that can be attained by things like infrastructure investments, improvements of basic service delivery, fiscal support for health, education. So from a research perspective, we hope it sort of shines a light on some of the things that we should or could be paying more attention to from a range of different disciplinary perspectives. And lastly, one always hopes that students are interested in this type of work as well. And that's why it was really encouraging that almost one of the first sort of things that came out of this volume was an online course, a massive open online course hosted by UNU Wider. And from that point, we've had a lot of engagements. It's been really satisfying to have engagements with postgraduate students from countries all around the world who want to know a bit more about some of the work that went into the book that we presented on the MOOC. So that was the intended audience of the book, and so far I think the take-up has been quite positive.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much. Viewers and listeners, those of you who would want to get their hands on this book, do not forget to click the link that is right in the description panel on the upload for this video. Thank you very much. I'm very much happy to have had you all, my dear panelists. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. Thank you for
you.
interviewing us.
Thank you.
Okay.